The day has finally come. Steve Cohen has officially been approved by Major League Baseball and will become the new owner of the New York Mets. And for every Met fan, this is a great day. And this is a day that should be cherished because this is a moment in sports that happens, if you're lucky, once in a generation. And you look right now at the New York Mets, Steve Cohen will be a breath of fresh air. He will help with this team. He sends them in a new direction. And you look at the Mets being a laughingstock under the ownership of the Wilpons. You believe that it's going to change with new leadership. And now we get to see new leadership, which will be much appreciated. And this is a great day, once again, for New York Mets fans. It is a joyous day. And it's a day that you look at, and for most bad sports teams, one of the constants among all of them is bad ownership. Because you can just look in this town, in New York, for an example of bad ownership and what that does. Because you can change the head coaches, you can change the front office, you can change the players, but the one thing in sports you rarely change is the ownership. And if you're stuck with a bad owner, that's not going to change. And we saw it with the Mets, and we see it with the New York Knicks and Dolan as their owner. And despite fan outcry that he should be removed, he still maintains, and even in random tweets, my favorite was the Spike Lee one last year where it was basically explaining why Spike Lee, and in the middle out of nowhere was the abrupt, "I'm not selling the team." Bad ownership doesn't change. You look at great organizations, it starts at the top. Name me a dynasty that didn't have a good owner. You can't do it. It's because it doesn't exist. And for the Met fans, they say goodbye to the Wilpons, which were the most frustrating owners over the last 2 decades. And not all of it is their fault. And the Wilpons should thank James Dolan in New York, because if he wasn't there, they'd be far and away the most hated owners in New York. And the Wilpons, they don't seem like bad people. They don't seem like they're hard people to work for. But the perception of them not having money and the perception of them not going for it and not fully being invested in this team was maddening to Mets fans, because there were blips like 2015, but that was really Sandy Alderson and not this ownership group, because they kind of just sat back, and if the Mets are good, great. If the Mets aren't good, yeah, we're still getting our money. And unfortunately, which didn't help the situation, was Major League Baseball, and Mets fans have this complicated relationship with Major League Baseball in the sense that Major League Baseball has not done any favors for the New York Mets in terms of this ownership group. Because if you remember, the Bernie Madoff scandal came out, the Wilpons were indicted, they were reported losing hundreds of millions of dollars, and despite all of that, they were left to run a Major League Baseball team in the number one media market in the country. And I think when Met fans really think about it, you look back and you say, why didn't baseball do more? Why didn't baseball... And baseball did, unfortunately, it was give the Wilpons a loan. And the Wilpons were great friends with Bud Selig and also with Rob Manfred, as was seen with the whole Carlos Beltran situation. And that, to me, for Met fans, is they got why Carlos Beltran was cut as the manager, but a lot of Met fans didn't like that. It was basically Major League Baseball saying, hey, Mets, can you do us a solid and get rid of Beltran? When Major League Baseball has not done anything to help this team. Like, if you look at, if I was to say this to a commissioner, one of your biggest teams in the biggest media market in the country, their owners were just part of a Ponzi scheme, and they lost hundreds of millions of dollars, and we don't know how much money they have to actually afford the team. You would think that that group would be investigated, and if they didn't have the money, they'd be forced to sell the team. But Major League Baseball didn't do that. So what happened was Wilpons didn't spend any money, and then you heard the stories about Fred Wilpon acting as a de facto general manager and basically wanting to run the team. And then they would do crazy moves like hire an agent to be a general manager, which was a disaster. And the other problem, too, is one of the things that I always hear is, well, the Mets can't be the Yankees. The Mets can't spend like the Yankees. And I get that argument to a point. But when you're in this massive market and you are a major market team in baseball, this isn't like any other sport. Baseball is unique because in baseball, you can spend more than other teams. There's no budget for teams. So if the Mets wanted to, they could spend as much money as they wanted to. But they didn't. And I'm not saying go out and just spend money willingly. I mean, we've seen Los Angeles Angels just throw money everywhere, and they're not a good baseball team. But for the Mets and the Met fans, they want like a good piece. They want a good player. They want to be involved in the big end free agents, and the Mets never were the last decade and a half. And the other more frustrating thing was the Mets would develop good talent but couldn't keep that talent. And this was a pivotal moment for the Mets because you look at contracts coming up for the Mets. Michael Conforto, who's become an all-star outfielder. You look at Noah Syndergaard. They have some good young players that are going to be due contracts, and under the previous regime, they would just let them walk. And we go back. Jose Reyes, great player, but the Mets, they didn't want to pay him. Justin Turner was a solid player. The Mets didn't want to pay him. You can go down the list of players that the Mets didn't want to pay, and even pay fairly, just normal salary. It wasn't like they were breaking the bank. And you just saw year after year they let these good players go that they developed. And now at least you have an owner that is a Met fan, is invested in this team, and is invested in the Mets because one of the things about the Wilpons, which is funny, and a lot of people outside of the Met fan circle don't know this, is, and the best example is the stadium they play in, Citi Field. A lot of my non-Met fans always ask me, why does the Mets field look like Ebbets Field? Well, that's because Jeff Wilpon, he was a Dodger fan growing up. That's why they have the Jackie Robinson Rotunda. He was a Dodger fan. And he loves baseball, New York baseball, but he didn't love the Mets specifically. I mean, Steve Cohen has grown up rooting for the Mets, loving the Mets. And if it had to come down to it, like I keep hearing this, de Blasio, they've looked into this. I mean, everyone you talk to says if de Blasio actually does this, he's going to lose in court. But the situation is Steve Cohen could just say, all right, screw you. I'm going to go build my own stadium somewhere on Long Island that doesn't look like a recreation of Ebbets Field because the Mets, I want to tell you this, they're not the Dodgers. I know that's shocking. I mean, that's news to a lot of people. But this will be just a nice, refreshing change because you want great leadership at the top. Now, once again, just because he has the most money doesn't mean he's going to give the Mets the biggest payroll, doesn't mean that the Mets are going to become the biggest spender in baseball, but you would anticipate that they're at least going to be aggressive in keeping their own guys and maybe going after a player or two and just being aggressive and wanting to win. Because that was the thing that was frustrating with the Wilpons is the Wilpons just seemed content on having a baseball team. They were content with just fans showing up to the ballpark. They weren't all in. George Steinbrenner, say what you will, but you knew he was doing everything in his power to win a championship. The Mets had talent. I mean, you look at 2015 and 2016, they had a talented team. And a lot of those pieces are still on this current roster. But you got the feeling that this ownership group's like, oh, they're a good team. That's great. They weren't, man, we got to do everything. We got to move heaven and earth to get this ring, get this championship. It was like, well, if we get the championship, that'd be nice. So you would hope that Steve Cohen is that type of owner. Once again, there's a lot of gray area. We don't know what he will be as an owner, but you just are refreshed by the change. That you have owners that you knew weren't going to spend, that felt like they weren't fully invested in this team, are out the door. I mean, one of the great stories that has come out in recent years was Nelson Doubleday, the previous owner with the Wilpons before he was bought out. He was the one that really brought Mike Piazza because the Wilpons were not really sure because Piazza's agent actually called him the Mike and the Mad Dog and said, look, he wants to come to New York. Steve Phillips came on the show later. He told him, that's not going to happen. Met fans called the front office. As the story goes, Nelson Doubleday saw all those people calling the front ticket office and basically went to Steve Phillips and said, look, we're getting this deal done. So that was the big difference. And with the Wilpons, you never got that. Once again, they just seemed content. And there's nothing wrong with owners that are just content. Like, we see it all the time in Major League Sports. They're content with just being a decent team or just making money, and it's frustrating for fans, and especially in a town where the Mets are in a town with the New York Yankees, a team that has that championship pedigree. The Mets are always the little brother to them, and then you throw on the fact too that the Mets don't spend any money. And it's funny because you look at the past decade, I mean, the Yankees haven't won a championship, and the Mets have been to the World Series. I mean, they're not that far apart as they used to be. And Met fans see that, and it's infuriating when you see a front office that's dictated by the ownership group. Because don't forget, Fred Wilpon basically made himself the de facto general manager. And this is a ownership group that screwed up true transactions. They were looking to be bought out in 2011. They screwed that up. And then Steve Cohen wanted to buy 80% of the team and give the Wilpons 5 years to own the team. And the first reason the deal fell apart was because Cohen basically was going to have zero say despite the Wilpons spending his money. And it was asinine to begin with, but it's just good to see that Steve Cohen's going to take over this baseball team, because the biggest thing he provides is the biggest thing you need when you have a sports team, and that's hope. You have hope now as a New York Met fan. You have hope that they might go out and sign a big free agent. You have hope that if the team develops a good young player, you don't have to worry about him going somewhere else like a Jose Reyes. You have hope that you have an owner now that actually grew up and watched this team that he owns and cares about the team that he owns, unlike the former owner. You have an owner with deep pockets, the deepest in the sport now, and you're hoping he will spend it. But you just have change now, and this is something, like I said earlier, as a sport fan, you rarely see, because in sports, you don't see owners change. If you're stuck with a bad owner until that owner decides he wants to sell the team, you're stuck with them. And for all you know, it could be a situation where, despite how bad it is, they want to keep it in the family. They might be getting big offers for the team, because sports franchises are some of the most valuable properties in the world right now. But they want to keep it in their family because they know in 10 years, the value is going to keep going up. It's not going to go down. So, and you saw that with the Mets. I mean, the Mets are sold for over $2 billion despite being in debt that their new owner is going to have to pay for in a season where they didn't have any fans. So for Met fans, put aside de Blasio, release that hatred of the Wilpons. This day has finally come. It took a long time to get here and a frustrating road, because it was hard. When you first heard of Steve Cohen buying in and that he would eventually be the owner, you had hope, because there was going to be money coming in and you were going to have a new owner. And when it didn't go through, I just remember Met fans being irate. And then when you heard the process that the Mets were going to be sold, and then you heard that it was a couple of groups, including a group led by A-Rod, Met fans were like, okay, but they weren't the owners that the fan base wanted. And this is the owner they wanted, because this is an owner that, once again, he's one of us. He's a fan of this team, and he wants to see this team win. And, of course, the big pockets. Now, once again, doesn't mean that the Mets are going to now have the highest payroll next season, but you would hope that at least they'll be aggressive in free agency, maybe bring in a big piece, but more importantly, sign the pieces that they already have. But the biggest thing for Met fans today is they have something with their ownership that they have not had in 2 decades, really, probably longer, but they have something that is crucial in sports to have for a fan base. And that, my friends, is hope. That's going to do it for this episode of Rich Sports Talk. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of our latest New York sports content, especially on the New York Mets. I promise you, you're not going to want to miss any of this as we head into the Major League Baseball offseason. So make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss anything.